Hey guys, so I am gone today, as you can see. I'm actually downstairs by Sandlin's room grading common assessments. So if anything goes wrong, technology's not working or something, someone can come find me and let me know. But today should be pretty simple. You guys are going to listen to a lecture about the origins of the Spanish-American War. Some of you may not even know that we fought the Spanish, but we did in the Spanish-American War. So we're going to talk about why that even happened. We're going to talk about why the United States starts to pursue imperialism. We're going to review some things about imperialism as well. While you're doing this, you're not filling out a guided practice or a note packet or anything like that. I made this like visual note sheet. It does have you take some notes and then does have you like circle and cross things out, things like that, but hits on those high points or has you reflect. So you can see it's 2 pages. And the first one's just kind of general imperialism, and then you actually start to get to the conflict in Cuba and Spain. And the second page is all about the causes of the Spanish-American War. So just make sure you follow the instructions as you go through this. You will need to have this turned in by the end of the day, if you get the video done. If not, the video is going to be posted to Google Classroom. You can always finish on your own. And make sure this gets submitted. So that is what you guys are working on and should be following along with as I go through the PowerPoint. So I'm going to pull that up and we are going to get started. Yesterday, I began discussing imperialism, and we looked at 2 different perspectives of imperialism. We looked at the perspective that the United States is a bully and we're going through and taking people's land and things like that. And then we looked at the perspective of some people in America that were like, no, we're trying to help people and like show them like democracy and liberty and things like that. So there's 2 ways of thought on U.S. imperialism. So keep that in mind as we go through and talk about this. So we're first going to kind of review imperialism, and then we're going to be talking about the beginnings of wars. You can see in the background here, Uncle Sam is at a restaurant, and he's wondering what to order, and you have a bunch of Latin American islands or the Philippines, Cuba, like the Puerto Rico pig, etc. So I thought that cartoon was interesting. Now, in case if you forgot, hey, hopefully you did not, because we did spend quite a long time on this in world history last year. But the definition of imperialism is one country exerting power or force over another. So essentially, guys, as we broke this down last year, it's just countries taking over countries. And there's multiple reasons why they would do it. We this year are going to be focusing on why is the United States partaking in imperialism. You know, we had a choice to make after the Civil War, after we got our stuff figured out in our own country. We're not fighting each other anymore. We're then industrializing. We're becoming powerful. We're becoming wealthier. What do we want to do? Like, what is our role in the world? And people really questioned that because, you know, we were once a country controlled by another country. So is it our job to not imperialize and expand and stuff like that? Like, is that not ethical for us to do? Or do we need to do that to stay up within the world and to be that powerhouse and to advocate for those countries of democracy and liberty? So we're going to look at what are some examples or reasons why a country would imperialize, specifically the United States. Last year when we talked about these, there was 5 different examples. And there were hand actions that I showed you guys. And so maybe you can remember some of those as I go through them. So number 1, and probably the most popular because everyone loves money, is economics. So if you can remember, I did the like money sign with my hands. And that was our symbol for economics. So for the United States, we could acquire more wealth. Like, we were creating things in the United States, and we could sell these items to other countries if we then started to expand. We could open up more markets and interact with other countries or get resources from other countries to build other products. And so it just posed a really great opportunity for us to have these training bases and to have these markets that weren't available to us before. Number 2, and another big one that people often consider, you can imagine right now I'm like flexing my arm muscle because we're exerting power, okay? Building up our military, and specifically what branch of the military And hopefully you are thinking the Navy. And so to help us become a more powerful country, number one, like we would take over little islands because we need fueling bases. Like going from California over to Asia, we need some stopping points along the way to have a military base, and we could have the Navy set up so we're not traveling that far. So like countries such as Guam or the island of Midway or even the Hawaiian Islands were all taken over because of their strategic location to China. We also wanted to build a bigger empire as well too, to expand our influence and our allies. And then there's the thought of nationalism behind it as well too. People have pride in your country when they're doing well and they're expanding. They can have something to be proud of. So that was another reason as well too. Ideology, imagine I'm pointing to my brain right now because it's what people thought. And this is the old white man's burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. Written by Rudyard Kipling. And if you remember, the white man's burden is to civilize these other people around the world because they don't know what they're doing, essentially is what Americans believed. Yes, it is very racist, but that was the thought process back then. That it was their burden to bear. They had to go over there and take over these countries. They could show them the right way of doing things. Kind of like when we talked about how we felt like, it was just easier to do stuff in English. And so they forced a lot of people that were speaking Spanish to learn English, just like we read in the story yesterday. So, another one that goes with ideology is manifest destiny, and this kind of mixes in with religion and ideology. This is something you guys learned about in 8th grade, which it was our destiny to expand westward, and go towards California and take over the new frontier and all of that. And some people believe manifest destiny still applied to this. Like it's our destiny to expand westward. Yes, we need to go take over those islands and take over more countries. Like that is our destiny. And the last one is pretty common, and it is religion. And you can, of course, I'm like making the praying symbol. That's how you remember that one. And that is to spread Catholicism or Protestantism. And so either way, mostly it was Protestantism. And so they were trying to spread Protestantism throughout the islands. A lot of them were Catholic because they were under the control of the Spanish. So we were trying to spread Protestantism. So you can see there are 4 there: economic, power, ideology, and religion. The only one that's not on there from last year is exploratory. The United States wasn't a main reason why they imperialized, was for exploration. That was not a main reason. The 4 main reasons were economic and power. Those are probably the top 2, ideology, and then also religion as well too. Now, there were some Americans who were very, very strong advocates of American imperialism, so pro-imperialism, and this was Alfred T. Mahan, okay, and he was a Navy captain, so you can imagine his reasoning goes along with the military, and he wrote this whole book, just about how the influence of sea power upon history and like why it's important to have a strong Navy. And he believed sea power was the key to national survival and international relations. Like you have to have power over the seas to be successful. And he traced it back all to the way back when talking about the explorers and the conquistadors and all of that. And that the reason why people were successful is because they had sea power. And so he's mentioned, powerful Navy and accessible ports means you're invulnerable to war, and so you are ready to go. Another strong advocate for imperialism is Josiah Strong. He was an Anglo-Saxon minister, and he was like a very strong advocate of the white man's burden. He believed the United States had a duty to civilize these lesser areas of the world, and that it was their job, or the Americans' job, to do so. So both these men went around and preached their ideas and were very influential to our government at the time, trying to decide, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go out there and imperialize? Like, what's our goal going to be as the United States? At this point in time, guys, like, we're not the big bad United States yet, like the almighty United States, one of the world's superpowers at the time. We're getting there, and this is a process in which we get there. And one of those processes is taking this step towards imperialization and getting more power in that aspect. So we won't be the big bad United States until after World War I and probably even into World War II because, we go through the Depression and all of that. So, yep, two people. And on your worksheet, make sure you're connecting the dots or drawing lines to the symbols that they would represent. This guy's Navy, Alfred T. Mahan, and Joey Strong, but Josiah Strong. Joey Strong's from the story yesterday. Now, this is something to reflect on. It's asking what inspired imperialist activity of the late 1800s. And so, think about it. I'm going to give you a few seconds here to kind of consider the question. So, hopefully you're thinking economic, political, ideology, and religion. So this is actually, hopefully you've seen this painting before. This is actually a painting of Manifest Destiny. So you can see it's like kind of like almost like an angel or like Lady Liberty, looking all very majestic, like going towards the west and expanding the west. And you can see as the settlers are moving west and the trains and the cities are building up, of course, the Native Americans were pushed out of their land. And so it's the same idea, though. Like, we should expand west. We should go into Asia. We should go into the Pacific and gain more territory. Now, hopefully all that makes sense. Kind of reviewing over why we would like to imperialize. This little box down here is annoying me. I'm sorry, I can't get that to go away. But anyway, we've reviewed over why we would like to imperialize, and now we need to review and talk about the Cuban conflict. Hey, what's the deal with Cuba? Like, well, what? Why are we talking about Cuba? Let's find out. So, 1890s, Spain had lost all of its colonies in the Western Hemisphere. You can see on this picture here, this is everything that Spain had controlled. And so, we haven't talked about Spain for a while. The golden age of Spain was with King Philip II. And you guys learned about him last year during the Age of Imperialism. And, Spain, not the Age of Imperialism, the Age of Exploration. And Spain took over everything and just, controlled so much. You had Ferdinand Magellan, you had Christopher Columbus sailing for the Spanish, and all those people claimed all that territory. And remember, Brazil only got, the Portuguese only got this, territory, Brazil here. But all the pink and the red is their territory. You can see Spain is right here. The Philippines are over here. That's where Magellan landed and died. But they had controlled all of that. But by the 1890s, and that was in the 1500s, they're taking over all of that. 400 years later, almost 500 years later, they don't have much. The only colonies they really have is Cuba and Puerto Rico, which is down here in the Caribbean area. You can see by Florida. So all of this had become independent, and Spain is going downhill real quick. And the Cubans at the time were not happy about being a part of Spain. They were over it. They wanted to be independent. They had seen all these other revolutions, the Haitian Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, the American Revolution, the French revolutions, and heard about all of this stuff. And they're sick of being controlled by a mother country, and they want to be independent. So Cuba then starts to launch a series of revolts in their own country to kick out these Spanish rulers. Well, my slide is loading. Oh, I need it to load. Let's see. I'm going to click escape real quick. And we will just go to the slide and present it. Sorry for this. Maybe, I don't know, this is weird. I'm just going to go talk at it from this perspective. And now my picture of Butcher Weiler is not showing up, but it shows up here. You see him? He's down there. I'll pull up a picture of him in a second. But enter in Jose Marti. Okay, so we have all this problem going on in Spain, in Cuba, And Jose Marti is like the George Washington of the Cuban Revolution. And so Jose Marti is like leading the Cuban rebels and like doing everything he can, but he's kicked out and he's exiled. And he goes over to New York to be exiled, but he doesn't stop with the movement. Like he is continuing trying to advocate for the Cubans and getting their independence. And he continues to fight for that independence. And then finally, you know, he riles all the troops up and he is going to go over to Cuba. And he goes over to Cuba. Marti returns, the great general for the Cuban rebels, and he dies in battle. So he's kind of like a martyr, and that really influenced them. And they were like, yes, like, let's go. Like, we need to get our independence. But, of course, you can see in this third area here, the Spanish are going to react. And they react by sending a man down into Cuba to deal with the Cuban rebels, and that man is General Valeriano Weyler, and he goes down there to suppress the movement. So we start out with a guy who's leading the independence movement. He gets exiled to New York City. He goes back. He tries to fight. He ends up dying. He's like a martyr to the people, kind of like the George Washington of Cuba. And then they send in this guy, and this guy is evil. He is crazy. So I'm going to try to present this again. I'll see if it works. Yeah, it works this time. So he is nuts, and we're going to talk about what he then does. Fun fact for you, Jose Marti has a statue in Central Park in New York City because that's where he was exiled to during the time, and he hung out there. So if you forgot where Cuba was, here is Cuba. There is Florida. So you can kind of see how close that was to the United States. It's going to start to be troublesome for some people in the United States. But anyway, moving on. General Weyler's nickname was Butcher Weyler because he was evil. And essentially he gets there, and the problem is he cannot keep people from supplying the rebels. Like the rebels are not being put down because they're constantly getting supplies from the civilians because the civilians are wanting to support the rebels. So Weyler's idea is like, okay, let's all put them into a camp. We're going to put them into this contained area and fence them in, and so they cannot give any more aid to the Cuban rebels, was his idea. Well, obviously, when he put them into these camps, they are going to be very similar to concentration camps. They do not have the medical care that they need. They do not have the resources or the food that they need to properly take care of these people. And 1 out of every 3 Cubans died in these camps. And so as a total, though, there's 400,000 Cubans that died. Guys, I had never heard of this. I'd never heard of this until I started talking about this and teaching about this. But essentially, it's nicknamed to some people as the Cuban Holocaust, in which these people were basically just starved to death. You can see these are the bones of the bodies of the people that had died. And what happens, I mean, this is only just a few hundred miles from America. Guys, like it's just a few hundred miles, and Americans find out and they cannot believe it. And then you have people saying, you know, we need to go help these people. Like this is not okay with what they're going through. So these people were treated horribly. You can see there's a very famished person here, basically starved to death. Someone going in and investigating all the bones and the remains of the victims of these camps. They were called the concentration camps. Okay, and so basically, you know, what they were doing is they're taking the civilians and they're putting them in camps so they cannot support the Cuban rebels. But really, like all this backfires because even though they took the people out of Cuba and put them into these camps, they couldn't get resources. But Americans then find out, and it's like, what the heck is going on? So then you start to have America's support. And so this is what really catches people's attention. Like we wouldn't have really thought much about it, but then all this stuff happens and it's crazy and it catches our attention. And then we're like, man, do we need to step in and get involved? Like these people are dying and they're not being treated properly. And so it kind of forces the hand of the United States to start looking at this problem a little bit more closely and see like, what do we need to do in this situation? So, America then is going to start to get some war fever, specifically coming from some media outlets in the United States. But first, I want you guys to consider, like, how can Americans relate to this situation in Cuba? And how can Cubans, like, pull on the heartstrings of America to try to get them to relate? Think about times in American history When we were once controlled by a higher power and not being treated properly and not having taxation with, or being taxed without representation in Parliament. Hopefully, you're thinking of the American Revolution, and what our whole country is based on is the fact that we were controlled by a higher power and we were not being treated properly. And so we fought for our independence, and we fought for those liberties, and we fought for democracy in those aspects. And so looking at this situation, you have big old Spain controlling Cuba and treating these people this way, taking away their rights and liberties, and that's going against what democracy stands for. And we're just, a few hundred miles away. And so people really then start to look at, okay, maybe we need to go help these people. It's not okay what's happening to them. So we're now going to kind of change into the causes of why we get involved in this war. So you can see the situation going on in Cuba, and like things are not good. And now we're going to look at like, okay, how does America finally declare war in 1898 on Spain? So there's 3 reasons why this happens. One has to deal with the media. Okay, and first you should know, during this time period, guys, there's no TVs, there's not even radio yet in some areas. There's no computers, there's no phones or any of that, there's no magazines. So people get their information from newspapers. They are very reliant on information. They get them from newspapers. So the 2 most famous papers in all of America, and especially in New York City, was the New York World. Okay, and that is published by Joseph Pulitzer. And if you've ever heard of the Pulitzer Prize, it's for journalism, a very prestigious award, obviously named after Joseph Pulitzer. And then the other newspaper that was competing against the New York World was the New York Journal, written by, or published by the head of the paper, William Randolph Hearst. And so I'll probably just refer to them as Hearst and Pulitzer. Pulitzer has the glasses and the mustache. Hearst does not. You can see because no other media existed, the public relied heavily on these newspapers, meaning these guys had power. Like they wrote something down, they were going to believe it. They had no other sources. Like this is how people got their information. And so these people were very, very influential in politics and whatnot. And you have to remember the goal of newspapers, guys, like the whole point of media is to sell papers. And they're going to do what they have to do to sell papers. And so that then leads us to a whole concept known as yellow journalism. Okay, you need to know this vocab term. This is one of the reasons why we have the Spanish-American War and why we got involved in the war is because of the rise of yellow journalism. Okay, what is yellow journalism? It's journalism that is based on crude exaggeration. So like it's just crazy exaggerated and sensationalized, and like sensationalism, like it's just nuts how exaggerated and how big they make things out to be when they really aren't that big. So you can kind of see in the background, I think it's funny, it says everything will kill you, read this to save your life. Hey, eggs. Okay, they had to do it, the horror, and look how the WC looks after the VIP remodeling. This headline will shock you, because yellow journalism was all about selling papers. You make up these crazy headlines because you stop and you look at that paper and you're like, what? And you look at that, it makes you want to buy it. Yellow journalism 100% exists today. The National Enquirer, like you can go to Walmart or those stores and you look and it says like, so-and-so is pregnant, so-and-so had liposuction, so-and-so's dead, the aliens are coming, like all that kind of stuff. It's just these crazy headlines, but it gets you to look at it, and you're like, oh, sometimes BuzzFeed, okay, has some pretty crazy headlines. So it's not just paper, it's also digital nowadays. Yellow journalism does exist. It's sensational, and it's hugely exaggerated, and it's just because it's trying to get your attention, and it's trying to get you to buy that product or look at that product or click on something. And you also know it's like clickbait, like it says something like, learn how to do this. And you're like, oh, and you want to click on it. It's like, oh, and then it takes you to some spam thing. So because of this is going to drag us into this war. So let's figure out how that happens. Looking at this cartoon, what can you infer about the cartoon? So I'm going to have you think about that as I talk about this fun fact here. So, fun fact, like, why is this called yellow journalism? Like, why do Donald Trump now refers to it as fake news. But essentially, kind of like the same thing, yellow journalism, because it's, exaggerated and stuff like that. But it gets its name, yellow journalism, from the Yellow World comic strip. So there was this little comic strip with this little boy who lived in New York City, and he got in all sorts of trouble. It's the yellow kid, this guy right here. It was published by the New York World and the New York Journal. Because this comic strip was both published, these two competing newspapers, and they're constantly in competition with one another to sell papers. And this guy was in both of them, and he's just this like crazy little kid who lives like in the tenements, and you can see he's drinking like alcohol, and he has no hair because he shaved it because of the lice, and it just like follows him and his little gang of friends and like sees all the trouble that they get into. So it's called the Yellow Kid. And then someone then coined the term yellow journalism because these two newspapers are fighting against one another, trying to sell more papers. And the thing they have in common that they're also competing with is this little comic strip. So that is why it's called yellow journalism. And you can see in this picture here, that is why they're wearing like these yellow dresses. So you can see Pulitzer's over here. And then Randolph Hearst is over here. And you can see what it says on their dresses. It says, "Say, young feller, watch de Tommy. I'm de Tomom. You can buy an idea. Good thing you don't push me. See, Pulitzer. Say, this is my war. I bought and paid for it. And if you don't stop bothering me about it, I'll have you put off the earth. See? P.S. My name is Hearst." And so you can see they are building blocks and they're spelling war. And so these two men, because they want to sell newspapers, are going to write these crazy stories about what's happening in Cuba, which is going to gain the attention of people all throughout America and kind of push us into the direction of getting involved in the Spanish-American War. So kind of reviewing this here, both papers supported the war because, hey, it gives them something to write about. It's interesting. People like dying to see these headlines, and they're doing what they could to sell the most newspapers. And so some examples, they were like, blood in the fields, blood in the doorsteps, blood everywhere, like just craziness. They made up these stories about Cubans being chopped up and fed to sharks and dogs, like, see that headline, like, yeah, you're going to read it, like, what the heck's happening in Cuba? They sent artists down there to, like, draw these things, and it would be, like, very exaggerated. You'll see a drawing later of an explosion. So they gave them visuals as well, too. And, of course, when we're looking for research, you have to see both perspectives. And so there was extreme bias. There was no sources from the Spanish, but everyone was super excited to read it. They're like, what's going on in Cuba today? And people could not get enough of these headlines. Granted, yes, some horrible things were happening in Cuba, but were Cubans being chopped up and fed to sharks and dogs? No, that was not happening. And so they were exaggerating things to get stuff sold. You can see up here, I like this cartoon, Yellow Journalism, the origin of fake news and clickbait. The fact-checking office is closed. It's like we'll work for facts, and Hearst is over here printing newspapers. So, number one, yellow journalism. Number two, hey, just because everyone's kind of on edge, like we're stirring the pot here, like, ooh, we need to get to go into war. And reason number two to get into the war is the Delome letter, which was sent out in 1898. Enrique Dupuy Delome was the Spanish minister to the United States. So this was the guy, if we wanted to talk to Spain, we talked to the Delome guy, and we would send messages through him. Well, Delome sent a message home to Spain, and in the message, it says, McKinley, our president, is a low politician. He is weak, and he's catering to the rabble. And basically just saying, our president is not confident, like he's not good at what he does, like he's just weak-minded, like not strong, can't lead the country. Well, it gets intercepted by Cuban spies. And of course, the Cuban spies don't bring it to the government. They're like, hey, newspapers, here you go, here's your next headline. And they publish the letter in the papers. And people were just astonished. Like, the headline said, the worst insult in United States history. And people just could not believe it. And so, once again, it's just, firing people up, stirring the pot. on the government side of things, it's like, okay, like, yeah, let's go to war. Let's go help these people. Why weren't we jumping into this? Well, you have to think, guys, the last war we were in was with ourselves. And then you think back even further, okay, you have like the War of 1812, and that really wasn't much, but the last major conflict we were in was in the Revolutionary War, when we fought against the British. So does McKinley really want to be the guy who gets us involved in another war to kind of start this? Like, he had something drastic had to happen for him to take that step and say, okay, we are now going to get involved in other people's affairs. We are now going to start to pursue a policy of imperialism, and we're going to get going at this. So, and that next thing is now coming. And so the final straw is the explosion of the USS Maine. So let's talk about the Maine. Hey, the Maine was a battleship that was sent to Havana Harbor to protect our interests. We send this massive battleship with all of its guns and stuff just sitting there in the harbor. And it's like, heck yeah, we're watching you. You better not mess with our people. You better not mess with our investments or anything like that. And that's in Havana, which is in Cuba. And on February 15th, 1898, that evening, the Maine mysteriously explodes, blows up, and kills 260 American soldiers. Now Americans are dead, and now you have caught the attention of everyone in the United States. Hey, like you can say insults about the United States, and we have all this yellow journalism, but once Americans start to die, it's now become a strong issue. So looking at this painting here, like this was an example of something that was in the newspapers. Some guy went and drew this, depicting the explosion of the Maine. And you're looking at this, and it seems dark and eerie and evil. And you can see the boats exploding. But what also do you see? Yeah, like there's like dead guys flying up in the air and flying over here, and the flag's turned down, and there's guys in the water. Like, they've super exaggerated it, and it's like, oh my gosh, like this. And it's pulling at your heartstrings. It's pulling at your emotions. When looking at it, it just makes you mad, like that someone would go and kill Americans. And that's exactly what they were trying to do, is to stir up your emotions, to be like, yes, we need to go to war. And so the rallying cry was, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And they were going to go get them. And so you can assume or imagine that, yeah, you guessed it, the Spanish were blamed for the explosion. Did we know the Spanish did it? Heck no, we did not. We had no proof that the Spanish did it. But of course the newspaper's like, it's Spain, so that we would be more apt to go and get involved in the war. But remember, the Maine was plastered everywhere. You can see destruction of the warship Maine was work of the enemy. Remember the Maine. Remember the Maine. Experts at the time said it was a Spanish mine. Navy personnel said that. Come to find out later, it's not. And you'll learn about what actually happened to the Maine, but I will tell you, it was not the Spanish that blew up the ship. But it was very convenient that the ship blew up for the newspapers, because now they had someone to blame the explosion on. So at this point, McKinley has no other option. He has to now demand that we basically go to war. But he gives them a chance first. He says, Spain, you need to let Cuba be independent. You must let them be independent. Spain's like, heck no. Okay, and then essentially we had no choice. We are going to declare war on April 21st, 1898. And we have now entered the Spanish-American War. This is one of the shortest wars in our history. We're going to dominate Spain, but we'll get to that next week. So it says, why would the journal jump to the conclusion that the Spanish were responsible for the explosion? So you can see political cartoon here, Call to Duty. We've talked about this, so I'm not going to tell you the answer or anything, but think about that and discuss with someone in your area if you guys have time. But I'm going to go ahead and move on. I just wanted to show you a few things here that I've seen of the USS Maine. If you've ever been to Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C., this is the military cemetery. There is a memorial to the Maine. That wreckage was in Havana Harbor for a very, very long time. They were debating, are we going to leave it there later on in history we leave the Arizona in Pearl Harbor with the bodies tombed in the ship? And they're trying to decide the same thing for the Maine, but they end up taking it out of the harbor, and they put the remains in this tomb here. So this is where the remains of the victims of the explosion are. This is the actual mast from the ship that you saw in earlier pictures. So that is the actual part of the ship. They also have the anchor of the ship there. There's me. And then also there's a couple cannons as well too. So that is all we have. Hopefully that all makes sense. Hopefully you guys were able to get your worksheet filled out. If you have any questions, let me know. Tomorrow we're going to be doing an activity of looking at different perspectives of who actually blew up the Maine, because actually countries all over the world teach different things. So hopefully you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. I will see you tomorrow.